Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be able to give this talk to the Theosophical Society. And over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce you to the topic of extraordinary awakenings or transformation through turmoil. This is based on the research I've been doing in transpersonal psychology, which is really spiritual psychology, over the last 10 to 15 years. And I'm going to share with you some of the remarkable cases I've investigated of people who've undergone spiritual transformation in the midst of intense personal suffering. And we're going to look into the reasons why intense psychological turmoil can give rise to spiritual awakening. And we're going to look at some of the principles that arise from this process and how we can apply them in our own personal development. So we don't, luckily, we don't have to go through intense suffering to undergo spiritual development, but there are some principles we can take from that process and apply to our own lives. So later on, I'm going to guide you through a couple of meditative processes to illustrate those principles. And I'll also read you a poem. I also write spiritual poetry, so I'll read a poem which applies to this topic. So to go back to the beginning, let me explain to you how my interest in this area began. And it began with my own spiritual experiences. When I was maybe 16 or 17 years old, I was in a lot of turmoil. I was quite a depressed teenager. I didn't understand myself at all. I felt alienated from the people around me. I felt alienated from my environment and from my family. And as a result, I was severely depressed. I contemplated suicide quite a lot. But occasionally, in the midst of my depression, I would experience moments of elation. I would be walking through a park, or I would be walking through the fields at my school, and I'd feel this sense of being uplifted, a sense that I was connected to my surroundings. The trees around me seemed like sentient beings. The sky above me seemed to be full of a radiance and a kind of harmony, and everything seemed to be interconnected. And I felt myself to be part of my surroundings. The world seemed to be full of harmony, and I was part of this harmony. And then, the experiences would fade away and I would return to my depression. But every so often, these experiences would return. And later, when I was in my 20s, I was a musician for quite a long time. That was my ambition, was to be a successful musician. But once my ambitions had inevitably come to nothing, I decided to enter the field of psychology because I wanted to understand my own spiritual experiences. In my early 20s, I began to read books about spirituality. I found an anthology of mystical experiences. There was a book called Mysticism, A Study and an Anthology by a chap called F.C. Happold. And when I read this book, I finally understood myself. I thought, wow, yeah, these are the type of experiences I've been having. So before then, I didn't understand my experiences, and they made me feel more confused, if anything. But I finally realized that I wasn't crazy after all. Or maybe I was crazy, but lots of other people were crazy too. So I wasn't alone in my craziness. So from that point onwards, my life became a journey of spiritual development, a journey of exploration and of different spiritual practices, different spiritual paths. And finally, by the time I was in my late 20s, I felt as though I'd integrated my spirituality into my daily life. And I finally understood myself. I finally accepted myself. So at that point, I decided to enter the halls of academia again. I'd already been to university, but I decided to go back to university to study a master's degree in psychology. And I entered psychology because I wanted to understand spirituality from a psychological point of view. I wanted to understand why spiritual experiences occur. And I wanted to look into the different contexts, the different situations in which they occur. And I also wanted to understand why there was the seeming connection in my own experience between depression and mental turmoil and spiritual experiences. I felt from my own experience that there definitely was a connection, and I wanted to investigate that in more detail. So I began to do research on what I call awakening experiences. You could call them spiritual experiences, you could call them mystical experiences, but I chose the term awakening experiences because in these moments, there is a sense in which our awareness becomes more intense. There is a sense in which we become more awake. And when we reflect back on our ordinary state of consciousness, it does seem like a kind of sleep. It seems like a limited, constricted state. In these moments of awakening, our awareness expands and intensifies. So I began to collect examples of awakening experiences and to study the reports and to study the different contexts in which they occurred and the different characteristics of the experiences. So now I'm going to share a few slides with you, and I'm going to share with you some of the findings of my research. By the way, this is my new book, which is called Extraordinary Awakenings, which is a summary of some of the research I'm going to share with you today, and an exploration of some of the principles which lie behind these extraordinary awakenings. But this is the question I began to ask in my research. And I can ask you this question now, and you can reflect on this question and ponder over your answer. Have you ever had an awakening experience in which your awareness of reality has intensified and expanded? This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become brighter and more real, and you've become struck by the unusual beauty and vividness of things. Perhaps you've felt a sense of connection to them and a deep sense of well-being inside you. Or perhaps you felt a sense of harmony and meaning pervade the world, a sense that all things are one and that you are part of this oneness. The experience may have left you with a sense that life is more meaningful. So these experiences are, by definition, temporary. Sometimes they last for a few seconds. Sometimes they last for a few minutes, a few hours, maybe a few days if you're lucky. But there is a sense in which a veil falls away and we gain access to a deeper and wider reality in which we discover revelations about the nature of the universe, revelations about our own being. But after a while, the experiences tend to fade away and there is a return to normal consciousness. But at the same time, when we return to normal consciousness, we carry with us the insights that we gained in these experiences, and we carry with us a new sense of positivity about life, a new sense of trust, a new optimism about life. So I'm sure probably most of you who are watching this video have had that kind of experience. I think these experiences are really the ground of spirituality. I think they are really the essence of all spiritual traditions. Although obviously they tend to be interpreted in different ways according to the concepts of different traditions. In my research, I wanted to find out which situations or activities give rise to these experiences. So with a co-researcher, I did a study of 161 of these type of experiences, and we looked into the activities they were associated with. And this is what we found on the next slide. We found that the most common trigger or association of these experiences was psychological turmoil, which is stress, depression, a loss, bereavement. So over a third of the experiences were connected to psychological turmoil. And that was quite surprising. I mean, even though I knew from my own experience that there was a connection, I was surprised that so many people had these joyful, uplifting experiences of joy and wonder in the midst of intense depression or stress. It's almost as if there is a shift from one extreme to another, a sudden flip from intense despair to intense joy. It's almost as if, joy and despair are not opposites. In some way, they seem to be deeply intertwined. The other triggers we found were contact with nature, which has traditionally always been a significant trigger of spiritual experiences or awakening experiences. And spiritual practice, as you would expect, is associated with these experiences. Although only around between a quarter and a fifth of the experiences were actually associated with spiritual practice. Also spiritual literature, which means watching videos or listening to audio recordings of spiritual teachings. So those were the three main triggers: psychological turmoil, contact with nature, and spiritual practice / spiritual literature. There were some more minor triggers such as love and sex, or watching or listening to an arts performance. I think there's a caveat here with on the question of love / sex, because people who take part in research are understandably reluctant to divulge intimate personal experiences. So in reality, there is probably a higher proportion of spiritual experiences associated with love and sex than is shown here. But it's certainly interesting that most of the triggers of the experiences were not linked to spirituality. They were linked to everyday situations, and they were out of the context of spirituality. But let me share with you a couple of specific examples of awakening experiences that were associated with psychological turmoil. This is an awakening experience which was shared with me by a soldier, an ex-soldier. And he's an elderly guy now, and he had this experience in Vietnam in 1969, I think it was. And this is how he explained it on the battlefield in Vietnam. With casualties mounting, I was in a state of high anxiety and figured there was no way I would live through this seemingly endless battle. At one point, after carrying yet another severely wounded Marine to a waiting chopper, something happened to me. It's actually indescribable, but I'll make a feeble attempt to do so. I opened up literally from my perspective. I came out of myself. I expanded infinitely. I disappeared. It didn't last long, but it was the most powerful experience I've ever had. So when this gentleman returned to the US, he wanted to explore this experience. He knew that there was something incredibly significant about it. And he knew that instinctively that it was associated with spirituality, even though he knew nothing about spirituality. So he learned to meditate. He investigated paths like Buddhism and yoga and Taoism. And he told me that he'd never managed to recapture this experience, even though he'd had similar, less intense experiences. But just the knowledge that this experience was there had been enough to change his life. I think as well as the intense stress of fighting in a war, fighting in a battle, I think an important aspect of this experience is the nearness to death, the reality of death. When you see people dying around you, when you know there's a chance that you may die as well, a strong chance in a war situation, then it changes your perspective. It makes you aware that there's something more to you than the physical body. And it makes you aware that there is something inside you which may survive the physical body. So here's another example. This was from a woman who was suffering from intense depression. She actually attempted suicide, and she was in hospital when this experience occurred. And what happened was that she woke up one morning in hospital, and she found a marble, as in the picture here, on her bedside table. She had no idea why this marble was there. She'd never seen it before. But she picked up the marble, held it in her hand and looked at it. And suddenly it became a symbol of oneness, as she describes here. So she said, I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems and my suffering suddenly seemed meaningless, ridiculous, simply a misunderstanding of my true nature and everything around me. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. It was a moment of enlightenment. The euphoria An inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days. And as with the previous example, this experience changed her life. She began to recover from her depression because she knew there was something positive in life. She knew that her problems were soluble, and she had a renewed sense of optimism and trust, which enabled her to eventually overcome her depression. So it's interesting to reflect on why is there such a strong association between intense psychological turmoil, whether it's stress or depression, and awakening experiences. And we'll reflect on that in a short while. But it was interesting in my research that although most awakening experiences are temporary, as I described earlier, I found that in some cases, people didn't actually return to a normal state of consciousness. In some cases, people would actually undergo a permanent shift. Something fundamental and deep would shift inside them, would change inside them, almost as if they took on a new identity. And they felt almost as if they were different people living in the same body. So maybe in about 1 in 50 cases, people did not shift back to a normal state of consciousness. They actually remained in a state of wakefulness. So they didn't have temporary awakening experiences. They shifted to an ongoing, permanent state of wakefulness in which they lived continually with an expanded and intensified awareness. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these permanent transformational experiences. So this is what I call transformation through turmoil. And I found in my research that, that there are so many different types of turmoil and trauma which could give rise to this transformation. It could be serious illness, such as a diagnosis of cancer. Bereavement was a major trigger. Losing a loved one can bring about such a major shift in your life that it's like an earthquake. It turns everything upside down. It breaks down your identity. And when the dust begins to settle again, people often find that they're living in a different reality. They have fundamentally changed, and the world around them has fundamentally changed. They have a new perspective on reality, and they have new values and new attitudes to the world, to life and the world. Depression is also a big one. Disability, addiction, or just in some cases, it was simply a long period of loss, a sense that their ambitions were slowly eroded away, and they lost any sense of achievement or success. Slowly, the aspects of their lives which defined their identity were taken away from them. And that led to a state of depression, a feeling of disappointment and failure, which would give rise to this transformation. So this is it's a dramatic personal transformation into a higher functioning state. And it's really a form of spiritual awakening. There are various spiritual traditions in the world. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with them. And they all point to some form of awakening. They all point to some ideal state in which people transcend separateness and attain some form of union. They attain contact with deeper aspects of their own being. They no longer feel separate to other people, to other living beings. They feel somehow permanently connected to the world around them with an ongoing sense of harmony and well-being, a freedom from anxiety, and so on. Every spiritual tradition has some form, some conception of this awakened state, whether it's body in Buddhism, whether it's deification or theosis in the Christian mystical tradition. In Taoism, it's sometimes referred to as Ming, which is when you attain a state of harmony with the Tao, and so on. But in my research, I found that people could attain that awakened state without any exposure to spiritual traditions, without any engagement in spiritual practices, simply through intense suffering simply through undergoing a psychological shift due to intense suffering. Later on, people often did become familiar with spiritual traditions in order to make sense of what had happened to them. Sometimes when people go through this shift, there is a feeling of confusion. Even though they feel so ecstatic, they feel connected to everything around them, they feel this sense of harmony, it is sometimes overlaid with a sense of confusion because they're thinking, wow, what's happened to me? Have I gone insane? Actually, one gentleman, he underwent this shift when he was in prison for 6 months. It's a long story, but he was captured by, he was in Africa and he was captured and put in prison for 6 months. And he was in a small room 23 hours a day. He had no familiarity with spiritual traditions, but he began to spend a lot of time alone with himself, exploring his own being, questioning his own values and so on. And eventually, after 6 months, he underwent a shift. But knowing nothing about spirituality, he wondered if he'd gone, if he was suffering from some psychological or psychiatric condition. So he actually got hold of a text of psychiatric disorders and went through it looking for his symptoms. But luckily, he didn't find his condition. But then he began to, he found a book about spirituality and he thought, wow, this is what's happened to me. I don't have a psychiatric disorder. I have undergone spiritual awakening. So it's not uncommon amongst prisoners and soldiers. It's also not uncommon amongst people who attempt suicide. I think when people are at the point of attempting suicide or seriously contemplating suicide, it's a point of surrender. It's a point of giving up, of letting go of life. And somehow that state of letting go, that stage of surrendering can enable this transformation to take place. And it sometimes happens to addicts after long periods of addiction, when they reach rock bottom through alcohol or drugs. And one of the strange ways in which it manifests itself in addicts is a phenomenon which I call addiction release. It's a sudden freedom from craving. So even though a person's life may have been dominated for 10 or 15 years or more by their addiction, when they undergo this transformation, the addiction suddenly leaves them in a very strange and miraculous way. And that's not an uncommon phenomenon. It may also manifest itself in a sudden disappearance of physical ailments and also of the negative effects of trauma. So when people undergo this shift, they often have many years of traumatic incidents in their lives. And under normal circumstances, this kind of trauma would cause very severe negative effects, post-traumatic stress disorder, and similar conditions. But people often find that the effects of trauma suddenly disappear. And we'll look into that in a little more detail shortly. People experience this shift as a new identity. It's a fundamentally different state, which is discontinuous with their previous state. So these are some quotes from people. One person said, it's like there are two people. There's a before and an after. Another person said, there's no going back. I'm a different person now for the rest of my life. And this is a beautiful description from another person who underwent transformation after bereavement. She said, I've moved up to another level of awareness, which I know is going to stay with me. It's like the transformation a caterpillar goes through during the chrysalis stage before emerging as a butterfly. That is a very apt description because it is almost as if people emerge in a higher, more developed form, as if a caterpillar emerges from the chrysalis. So let me share with you a couple of more specific examples. This is a lady called Ananta Kranti, and she underwent transformation when she was in prison. She was in prison in Japan for 3 years in very severe conditions. They were basically treated as slaves. They would work 16 hours a day in a factory, and they had very little exposure to daylight, very little exercise, very few privileges, very poor diet. So after several months of imprisonment, she was exhausted. She felt completely broken down, physically and mentally, as you can imagine. She also had no idea when or even if she would be released. And this is what happened to her when she underwent her transformation. She said, "One day I came back to the cell from the factory and I was just about to start reading and I couldn't. I was in too much pain. I lay back and kept dropping and dropping into the pain. It was excruciating, but I had to surrender to it. There was nothing else I could do. Then a moment came when there was no body anymore. I dropped into a space where the physical body was no more. Whatever I dropped into just kept opening and opening into more and more light, beauty, into gratitude, freedom, freedom. And I just kept letting go and dropping and dropping. There was only this beautiful love and bliss." And this experience didn't fade away. It became a permanent state. She felt that she had permanent access to this bliss and love. As long as she did this practice of letting go, as long as she surrendered and stepped back from her predicament. And that enabled her to endure the terrible conditions in the prison. She was in an ongoing state of bliss and harmony. And after 3 years, she was released and went back to England. And in the way I described earlier, she found it difficult to integrate. She found it difficult to understand what happened to her. She knew nothing about spirituality until a spiritual teacher told her that she'd undergone an awakening. And she realized that this described her experience. So eventually, many years later, once she had integrated her experience, she became a spiritual teacher, which she is now. Let me share with you another example. I mentioned earlier that there is a connection between suicide and these transformations, and also between addiction and these transformations. This is the story of a lady called Eve, a Scottish lady who underwent an extraordinary awakening after 29 years of alcoholism. And by that time, actually, you can see in the picture here, the picture on the right, Eve gave me these pictures. The picture on the right is just after she underwent a shift. You can see that she's physically in a very bad shape. And this is a picture of her now, 10 years later, 10 years after her shift. But going back to 10 years ago when she underwent her shift, she felt that she was a wreck, an empty shell. She'd lost everything. She was homeless by that time. She'd lost a friend. She'd broken contact with her family. She'd given up any pretense of living a normal life, any pretense of holding down a job or pretending to be a respectable person. She was basically homeless and living off the streets, living by shoplifting and stealing. So at that point, she was a wreck, an empty shell. Physically and mentally, I'd walk a few steps and then have to stop and sit down or lie down. I had nothing to live for, nothing to give. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I don't have the strength. So she decided to commit suicide, to kill herself. And she knew that there was a bus which went by from Glasgow to Edinburgh at a certain time each day. So she jumped in front of the bus. But luckily, the driver swerved and she survived the attempt. And a policeman took her back to her parents' house. And her parents assumed that because she was an alcoholic, they would have to give her a drink to control her withdrawal symptoms. So they gave her a glass of wine. But by this time, she'd already undergone the transformation. The transformation seems to have occurred in the moment of attempting suicide. And this is what happened afterwards. She says, I picked up the glass, lifted it, and put it down. I kept picking it up and putting it down. It wasn't me that was putting it down. Then she looked at herself in the mirror and she said, it was one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had. I had no idea who I was. I didn't connect with my reflection. I felt like a completely different person. So she felt like she had undergone an identity shift. And in a very strange and miraculous way, her addiction left her. The doctor knocked her out for a couple of days to deal with her withdrawal symptoms. And by the time she came round, she felt free of the craving for alcohol. And it remained as a permanent ongoing state. She said, "My whole psyche changed completely. I have no trauma in spite of all the terrible things I went through. It was like being catapulted from one world into the next." Eve said that once she started to go to AA meetings, she felt guilty because a lot of people were struggling to stay sober, but she was finding it easy because she just lost her craving. I think the way to explain this is that she literally did take on a new identity, and the new identity which emerged inside her had no craving for alcohol. It had no addiction. The addiction had died with her previous identity, and all the trauma that she'd been through had also faded away with her previous identity. So in her new spiritually awakened self, in her new identity, she was free from any addictions and any trauma that she'd been through. So let me just explain, or try to explain, why these awakenings occur. I think they are quite mysterious and miraculous. So I don't think we will be able to explain them completely, but I think there are some clues. I think there are some psychological reasons or spiritual reasons why they occur, which I will briefly explain to you now. The main factor, in my view, is ego dissolution, either through intense stress causing a sudden breakdown, or through a dissolving of psychological attachments. When people go through a period of intense loss or intense depression or addiction and so forth, when they reach the very severe negative side of these experiences, their ego begins to dissolve away. Their sense of identity begins to fade away. If you're an addict and you basically go through a long period of loss in which all of the things which define your identity are slowly taken away from you, whether it's your status, your roles, your possessions, your friends, and so forth. All of these things are taken away. Also, your ambitions of the future, your sense of achievements, and so on. Everything is taken away. And all of these things, all of these psychological attachments, such as ambitions, possessions, status, success, beliefs, and so forth, these are the building blocks of the ego. So when these attachments dissolve away, the ego itself dissolves away. It's a bit like, if you take away enough bricks from a house, eventually the house itself will collapse. That's what's happening in these experiences. As people go through a long period of loss or disappointment or depression or addiction, slowly the building blocks of the ego are taken away. And eventually, at the point of rock bottom, the ego itself collapses like a building in an earthquake. And once the ego collapses, there's suddenly an open space inside us. And in some people, there appears to be a latent higher self, a latent spiritually awakened self, which is waiting to emerge. And it emerges like a phoenix from the ashes of the old ego. It emerges within them and fills the empty space of their being. It becomes their new identity. So that was one of the main findings of my research, that in many people, there does seem to be a latent higher self, a latent spiritually awakened self, which is ready. It's fully structured, it's fully established, and it's just waiting for the opportunity to arise and to take over. But it can only take over once the normal ego, with all its attachments, with all its beliefs and ambitions and so forth, once that ego fades away. But one of the big questions that I felt I needed to answer was, why doesn't everybody undergo this transformation? Because all human beings go through suffering. As the Buddha said, life involves suffering. Everybody goes through intense psychological turmoil, whether it's through bereavement, depression, stress, and so on. It's part of human life. So why doesn't everybody go through this transformation? One factor which seems to be important is a sense of openness to experience. I found in my research that women were more likely to undergo transformation through turmoil. And, I don't really understand why that is, but perhaps it's because women in general have a quality of openness. Maybe they are slightly more empathic in general terms, slightly more open to other people and to the world in general than men. Well, people who are kind of more boundaried, more controlled, people with stronger egos were less likely to have this experience. I guess that's because you need to let go. If you have a strong ego with strong boundaries, with a sense of control, then you are less willing to let go. More fundamentally, it seems to be a question of readiness. In many people, that spiritually awakened latent self, maybe it just isn't ready to emerge. Maybe those people need to do more work at an unconscious level. Maybe there needs to be more processing in their unconscious beings so that eventually they become ready to undergo this transformation. But I found that the main factor in whether people undergo transformation through turmoil is acknowledgement and acceptance. In particular, acceptance was a very important factor. A lot of the people I spoke to in my research could identify one particular moment when they let go and accepted their predicament, when they stopped resisting their state, they stopped fighting against their suffering and suddenly opened themselves, suddenly embraced their situation rather than trying to push it away. A good example was Ananta earlier. She, as you will recall, she decided to just let go and drop into her suffering. And I think in the case of somebody like Eve, whose story I just told, as I said before, once you reach the point of contemplating suicide or attempting suicide, in a sense, that is a letting go. It's a giving up. It's a form of surrender. So that's probably why there is an association between these experiences and suicide. But as I said, this moment of acceptance seems to be incredibly important. That seems to be the trigger that enables this transformation to take place. First of all, we have to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Because, often it's very difficult. If you are diagnosed with cancer, for example, it's very difficult to face up to the reality of that predicament and all of the suffering and anxiety it may entail. It's very difficult to face up to the reality of death. But if you find the courage to do that, then there is a chance that you will undergo this transformation. Acknowledgement leads to acceptance, and acceptance can lead to transformation. So in the light of that, now I'd like to guide you through a process which you could use in your own life. Because, as I said before, we're all going to face suffering at some point sooner or later. We're going to face crises in our lives. We're going to face challenges, intense psychological turmoil. So we need to know how to respond. And since we know that psychological turmoil can have a transformational effect, we need to respond in such a way that we can harness the transformational effects of challenges and crises. So I'm going to share with you a three-stage process which we can use to respond to challenges and crises when they occur in our lives. So yeah, this is about harnessing the transformational potential of adversity, because all of my research shows that adversity does have very powerful transformational effects. And we should be able to harness these effects if we approach or respond in the right way. So as I described earlier, just now, the first stage is acknowledgement. And maybe we can actually practice this now. Maybe you don't have to actually ponder over a situation in your life which is causing you challenge or crisis or suffering, but maybe you can just imagine or contemplate a potential situation in your life which may cause difficulties, which may create turmoil. But if you feel that you are able, you could bring to mind a certain real situation in your life now, which is causing you some degree of tension or turmoil. So as I suggested just before, the first stage is acknowledgement, facing the reality of your predicament without mentally pushing it away. So that means, bringing the predicament and the situation into the forefront of your awareness rather than diverting your attention. And it also means contemplating the reality of the situation and the consequences which may follow from the situation and the effects on people around you, the effects on your life. It means turning the whole of your attention towards the predicament rather than turning to the side or looking away. So let's make a mental effort to do that. Just contemplate the reality of the situation. Imagine that it's lying directly in front of you, directly in your line of vision. And even if you can feel some degree of tension or turmoil as you look at the situation, just keep focused, keep yourself open. Just acknowledging and facing the reality of the situation. The second stage is to explore the feelings and thoughts which the situation gives rise to. So if you feel some degree of tension or frustration or some degree of negativity, just allow yourself to enter into your own being and just explore those feelings. Be aware of them, observe them. Just watch any thoughts which arise about the future, any daydreams about the situations associated with the predicament. Just observe those thoughts and feelings. And what you'll probably find is that as you are aware of those experiences, they will become less painful. Any negativity you feel will slowly fade away. You'll become aware of a space inside you between you and those thoughts and feelings. You'll be aware of a distance between you and them. And allow that distance to grow wider. Allow the space between you and your feelings to increase, to expand. And as the space expands, you'll feel how the emotions or thoughts become less disturbing, almost as if they are ripples on a lake which slowly settle, which slowly fade away as the surface of the lake becomes smooth and calm. So this ability to explore our own feelings and thoughts is very important. It means that we enter into our own being and we bring the light of awareness onto those feelings And the light of awareness always has a calming effect. It always takes away mental turmoil and anxiety. It brings a sense of oneness. We become one with our thoughts and feelings rather than trying to resist them. And as we become one with our thoughts and feelings, they become more harmonious and more benign. And at this point, we can move on to the final stage of acceptance. Once you're aware of your mental resistance to your predicament, you can let go of the resistance. You can release the resistance. You can open yourself to the predicament. You can accept the predicament and also accept the feelings and thoughts which accompany the predicament. And when you do that, when you let go and release your resistance, then you may feel a sudden uprising of well-being inside you. Acceptance is the most important stage of this process. So I'd like to explore it in a bit more detail for a few minutes with a meditative exercise. So as I described earlier, meditation has an acceptance has an almost alchemical effect. It enables a sudden shift of identity to take place in the midst of intense suffering. And throughout our lives, in every aspect of our lives, acceptance can have an alchemical effect. And I'd just like to illustrate that with a poem of mine called The Alchemy of Acceptance. After I read the poem, I'll lead you into a meditative exercise on acceptance. The Alchemy of Acceptance. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, glowing with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. A task may seem tedious, a chore to rush through reluctantly, or a task may seem rewarding, a process to relish with an attentive mind that reveals more richness the more present you become. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a sharp, concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape, to push away the pain. Or pain can be a sensation that you can move toward and merge with, that no longer has a center and dissipates through your being until it becomes soft and numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of your being, give rise to a greater structure, a miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating, full of obstacles, with desires for a different life constantly disturbing your mind. or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Let's practice the alchemy of acceptance now for a few moments. I'd like you to contemplate one aspect of your life where you feel some resistance. It could be something physical, a physical complaint or condition, which causes you some frustration or turbulence, and therefore gives rise to resistance. It could be something as simple as a daily chore or task in your life, an everyday responsibility which you resent in some way, or which you don't find enjoyable. It could be certain people that you have to deal with. It could be a simple daily chore or an aspect of your job that you don't enjoy and which therefore creates resistance. Perhaps it could be an aspect of your life situation, maybe the place where you live, the people you live with, the relationships you're in. Maybe you don't feel that you are where you ought to be in your life. Maybe you feel you should be more successful, or you should have entered a different avenue, a different career, for example. Or perhaps there are certain fundamental aspects of life itself where you feel resistance, such as the aging process, how your body changes as you get older, how your face changes, or maybe death. Maybe you feel some resistance to the prospect of death, which is, which is entirely natural. Death can be a very difficult prospect to face. I think a lot of human beings feel some resistance to death. And when we resist any aspect of our lives, it creates discord. Resistance is always associated with discord, with frustration and resentment. It also creates a sense of duality, because if you resist something, you are always in opposition to it. You are always in conflict with it. But when you accept it, you become one with it, and your life falls into harmony. When you shift from resistance to acceptance, there is a sudden embrace of your life, a sudden fading away of conflicts and duality, and a sudden feeling of oneness with your life, or with any aspect of your life. So let's do that now. Hopefully you are contemplating one particular aspect of life where you feel resistance. Now I'm going to guide you through a process of letting go of your resistance. So it may help to close our eyes for a moment. It may help to just be aware of your breathing for a moment, just to follow your in-breath and out-breath until you feel more centered within yourself. Just feel the air as it enters and leaves your nose for a moment. And once you feel settled within your own mental space, bring that situation or that aspect of your life into your awareness. Just contemplate it for a moment. And maybe you can also feel the tension and discord which is associated with that aspect of your life. And as I described earlier, just be aware of any tension or discord which arises when you contemplate this situation. Be aware of the space within your being, the space between your awareness and your thoughts and feelings. Root yourself in your awareness and allow those thoughts and feelings to flow by, almost as if you're sitting on a riverbank watching the river flow by, rooted in a point of stillness. And maybe you can feel how tension and discord begin to fade away as you are aware of them, as you feel the space inside you around those thoughts and feelings. And now I'd like you to imagine that there is a cord or a string connecting you, a bond of some form connecting you to the situation which creates resistance in your life. Imagine that you are connected to it through this bond or cord, and you can feel the tension that arises through the connection. You can feel the tension which connects you to that experience. And now we're going to imagine that the connection, that the cord that connects us to this experience slowly dissolves away. And as it dissolves away, we feel a sense of release. And we can do this with our out breaths. With your next out breath, just mentally picture letting go of your connection. Imagine that the cord is dissolving away. And as it dissolves away, you feel a sense of release. You feel a sense of letting go. All of the tension fades away and you feel a sense of release. So let's do that with our next out breath. Just release. Allow the cord to dissolve away. You can repeat it with a few more out breaths, just to make sure that the cord has fully dissolved away. And every time you breathe out, just feel the release of letting go and accepting that situation. Feel the relief of embracing that situation rather than struggling against it, rather than being in conflict with it. You can feel a sense of harmony and oneness with the situation, rather than conflict, as you shift into a mode of acceptance, rather than resistance. So just feel that sense of release and relief as you accept the situation and release your resistance to it. Finally, I'd like you to picture your whole life as if it's a landscape spread in front of you, as if you're on the side of a mountain overlooking the panoramic landscape of your life, every aspect of your life, all your responsibilities, all of the fundamental realities of life, such as aging, such as death, all of the people who are in your life. Just imagine that it's there in front of you, like a landscape. And let's now make a mental effort to embrace the whole of that landscape just as it is, in a mode of acceptance. Accepting every aspect of our life as it is right now. Maybe there are some aspects of our lives that we need to change, which should be improved or changed. But we can begin by acknowledging and accepting the reality of those aspects right now, in a state of complete openness and complete acceptance. And perhaps as you shift into a mode of acceptance, you can experience something of the liberation and well-being which people experience when they undergo transformation through turmoil, which, as I described earlier, also arises from a state of acceptance. Let's retain that state of openness and acceptance to every aspect of our lives. Also, that's that state of oneness with our lives as they are. And let's slowly open our eyes again and bring this exercise to a close. That was a way of illustrating and hopefully experiencing the transformation which people undergo in the midst of intense psychological turmoil. I'd like to leave you with one final thought before I finish this session. And that is that, in my view, there is an evolutionary aspect to these experiences. I've always been fascinated with the evolution of consciousness. And it's always seemed to me that spiritual awakening is part of the evolution of consciousness. From the beginnings of life on Earth, evolution has impelled living beings to greater awareness, to more expansive awareness of reality, to more expansive awareness of their own beings and of their connection to other living beings. And spiritual awakening, whether it's temporary in the form of awakening experiences, or whether it's permanent in the form of transformation through turmoil, it is a continuation of that process. So when people undergo a shift and they feel as if a latent higher self is waiting to emerge, and it does emerge in the midst of intense suffering, it is almost as if a new level of human consciousness is revealing itself. It's almost as if an evolutionary shift is taking place. And I feel that very strongly. I feel that there is a shift, a collective shift underway within the human race towards a higher functioning state, towards a higher level of consciousness. And I think the people I've described are examples of that. I think they are undergoing a shift which maybe in some way the whole human race will eventually undergo. And of course, at the moment, we're going through a lot of turmoil as a species. We are facing intense crises as a species collectively. So even, on a collective level, we will hopefully undergo transformation due to the challenges we face. We will hopefully undergo transformation through turmoil collectively in the face of the crises we are facing. Thank you very much.